Hello and welcome along to the Property Academy podcast by Obus Partners. I'm your host, Steve McKnight.
And I'm Andrew Nicol.
And today on the show, we're talking about, is this government policy going to be the housing crisis killer?
Deja vu.
Could it lead to a housing oversupply? And when will these new rules kick in? Of course, we are talking about the RMA reform. But I always think every time I hear like, oh, we're going to change the RMA, my eyes always glaze over because there's all of this technical speak and you kind of don't know what the politicians are really doing. So simplify it down for us, Andrew. What is the RMA, the Resource Management Act?
So the RMA basically is the rules that govern what you can do with your own land. And so basically what you can build and where you can build it. Now, Labor, they tried to do this. The National came in, they scrapped all of Labor's rules, and now they're going to rewrite the rules again. And basically, they want to make it easier for developers to build more houses.
And, I think we could all understand that in principle. Okay, we're going to change the rules, try and make it easier to build. But it's sometimes like getting blood out of a stone to try and figure out, well, what is actually changing? And I was just saying off air, if I had $1 for every time a politician said, we're going to change the RMA, I've come up with this idea. We're going to change the RMA.
New idea.
We're going to fix the housing crisis, and it's all going to be good. Honestly, I wouldn't have to invest in property if I had $1 for every time a politician said that. I'd be as rich as Andrew Nicol. And so, it kind of feels like the RMA is like Madonna. It's had so many facelifts and makeovers.
You've been thinking about that one all weekend, haven't you?
Yeah, talk to ChatGPT. Give me an analogy.
Did you?
No, I didn't. But I should have.
I thought ChatGPT is getting quite sassy.
So, Andrew, what are these new rules going to do?
Well, the whole idea is that it is just going to make it simpler so that you can build more properties on your land. And the real problem is that all the way through kind of a construction process, there are just all these different areas that you get a no out of. The councils are very good at giving you a no. And I'll give you an example I saw on the spin-off. A builder wanted to put an 11-story apartment block on a site in K Road in Auckland. So really central location. And obviously that was going to add to the housing supply, which is awesome. And then the council said no.
Why did they say no?
Well, the council's problem with the proposal was that they thought that it was going to significantly impact in a negative way K Road, right? K Road's massive. And there's
adding housing supply to an area of the country and the city where there's actually a decent amount of homelessness, that's going to negatively impact K Road if we build more houses.
Yeah. And if you know the site, and I knew instantly the site that they're talking about here, that site's been bare for ages. Just got a big wall along it with a bunch of posters.
So it's an empty lot at the moment.
Yeah.
I think it's right between a car park and a petrol station, right? And they're saying, oh, wow, no, it's going to impact the neighbours. Really good impact that petrol station. And so
the petrol station would love it.
The spin-off starts querying this. That's a publication in New Zealand. And they were like, well, come on, how's it going to impact the car park next door and the petrol station? They said, oh, well, it's going to impact, we see that it could potentially impact all of K Road because we're going to have a new apartment block. K Road's, got a bit of character.
It's a grungy.
Yeah, a little bit, but in a nice way. I mean, it's got some great restaurants, quite like K Road. But they're like, well, if you build this big 11-story thing here, it could impact the whole road. And you're like, yeah, in a positive way because you've got more people living there in a part of the city where we need more housing. So council's got real creative at saying no. I'll give you another example that I saw. In Balmoral, which is another suburb in Auckland, a developer wanted to build 3 townhouses, right? The council said no because we need to preserve tram heritage in the suburb. Now, there's never been trams in Balmoral. I'll give you another one. In Waiuku, which is a suburb in South Auckland, quite rural, there were some people who wanted to put in a dairy, right? And then the council basically said no because there might be too many traffic jams by people trying to get it in and buy some snacks. I'm like, have you been to Waiuku? There ain't no traffic jams down there.
People getting a sausage roll going to cause a major traffic jam. Plus, we're talking about Auckland here.
The other one, and this is the one that really got me. So the spin-off reported that Auckland Council opposed some new housing. This was at Sylvia Park, which is a major mall, because motorists won't be able to see a hill. And so what the council said was that if they build these new houses near the mall, well, that could overpower the motorway's initial sense of connection with Hamlin's Hill. And so basically they were saying if we put in this housing, that could ruin people driving on the motorway's spiritual connection to the hill.
Who's looking at the hill? Aren't we all busy texting while we're driving?
I don't know what shamans are working for Auckland Council checking all of this, but I think some of these examples, add them all up and you go, it probably has gone a bit too far. You can't even build what you want on your piece of land, even if it's not really going to impact other people. And this kind of idea of, what counts as impacting other people is so expansive.
Yes.
So National's talking about wanting to move from a culture of no to their slogan is move to a culture of go, but what does that actually mean in practice?
It'll probably be a culture of maybes, let's face it, but there hasn't been any lockdown rules yet. This is obviously what they're going to work through over the next wee while, but the whole idea is that if you've got some land and you're going to build on it and there's not going to be a negative impact on someone else, then you should be able to get a yes.
Yeah, and they've got some quite interesting principles, which I agree with most of them. Even though I'm always skeptical of RMA reform, given that everybody says that we're going to make everything so much more simple, like saying, right, rather than having one law, we're going to have two laws. We're going to have a planning act and we're going to have a natural environment act.
That's so much simpler.
We don't need one law, we need two. But I do agree with some other things, like saying, we're going to really dive in this economic concept of externalities, which is basically like you and me own houses that are right next to each other. Now, if I build a 6-story building, that impacts you because I'm going to cast a big shadow over you. So there should be a rule that means that I can't build this massive apartment block right next to you because that's going to have a negative externality on you. However, if I build a 2-story house and it doesn't cast a shadow over you, well, you don't really care what the floor plan is inside of my house. I should be able to make it whatever it is because that only impacts me. It doesn't impact you. And so what some of the principles, Chris Bishop, the housing minister, is saying is, well, if we think about apartments, there should be rules around where you can build apartments and how tall they can be and if they cast shadows, all of that. But there shouldn't have to be a rule around whether apartments have to have balconies or not, because that doesn't impact the petrol station next door. That only impacts the people who live in them. And it impacts the developer and what they can sell that property for. Similarly, the internal floor plan of these apartments, well, that doesn't impact other people. It just impacts the person who is living in there. So there should be fewer rules about what happens inside the building, but we can still have some rules about how tall you can build them, maybe what it's made out of, make sure that it meets the good building code as well. But, we could relax some of these rules. I think that's fair.
I know I'm talking to a bunch of developers at the moment who are really struggling with council's overreach, is that often there are times where they say the council want us to do this. That's not what the market wants. So, in fact, one developer who was in our Christchurch office the other day said, I want you to write a letter and just outline exactly what you've just told me in terms of the feedback we've given him about a project, which is the thing that the council is pushing you to do, that won't sell. People aren't going to want that. The market doesn't want that. So who cares if the council wants it? Let's just do something that's right to provide more housing.
What was the issue?
I can't remember off the top of my head.
It was probably something. I know we've had a couple of instances where the council said, oh, you don't want to have that many car parks in that development. Cut those down.
Yeah, it was probably around car parks. That's a big one. But there was something else a bit obtuse. I can't remember what it was.
There's another interesting one. So I didn't realize there are something like 1,100, almost 1,200 different zones in New Zealand. And it's because we have 66 different councils. And so they have developed all of their own rules in terms of what's a commercial zone, what's a medium residential zone, what's a residential zone, and they'll all have slightly different rules because they're all independent. The government wants to scrap all of that and say, no, we're going to have 12 to 15 zones. They're all going to have the same definitions. And you, local council, all you different 66 councils, you get to decide how you zone your areas, but you have to use our definitions because that way we can standardize it across New Zealand. I know that recently happened in Melbourne and in Victoria over in Australia. My understanding is that also happened in Japan, where they started scrapping all of these different definitions, trying to standardize it a bit.
So if I get this right, so rather than Christchurch having its definition of residential and then Auckland having a different definition, everyone's just got the same one. And so then if a developer's wanting to go build in a different location, or someone, the councils are stretched in Auckland at the moment, so Hamilton picks up some of their consenting process, it makes it a lot easier, right?
Oh, yeah, I didn't actually, to be honest, I didn't even think about councils outsourcing it. That would happen as well. I think it's probably mainly going to impact group home builders, or developers who are operating in multiple areas. I'll tell you the other people who it could help is land surveyors. So I remember when we had Service on here, and they were talking about how, well, if you want to subdivide a property in Auckland, it's going to be very different. If you want to subdivide in Christchurch, it's going to be very different than if you want to subdivide in Selwyn District, which is just 15 minutes that way. So they've got all of these different rules. But actually, if we can simplify it down, that could really benefit a lot of people.
But the whole idea of this reform is that we're going to move to a yes unless approach. So you should be able to get a yes unless it has a significant impact on someone else.
Now, one thing that I've always liked is a bit like, okay, sweet. How much of an impact is this really going to have? Because it sounds good, but, what's the practical impact on housing supply?
Well, I think the big one that you and I were talking about off air is that actually this is going to be quite a long process and is actually not going to come into force until 2027 to begin with. And then the councils have to understand the new policies. It might slow down, things might bottleneck for a wee while. So yes, there could be an impact, a positive impact at some stage, but it is quite a wee way down the road before we start to see an impact. It might be kind of 2 to 5 years before we see any kind of meaningful change.
The other thing you've got to factor in is okay, best case scenario, this gets into council's hands in 2027. We have an election in 2026.
Oh, yeah.
Right? That's the next election that's coming up. And so let's say, we're so far out, you can't really forecast too much based on today's polls. But let's say that Labor gets in. They might scrap National's rules just like National scrapped Labor's rules before and say, do you know what we're going to do? The way we solve the housing crisis is we're going to rewrite the rules again. So you're like, oh, okay, that could potentially happen. There could also be delays to this coming in. They might write the rules and say, cool, we've got these 15 zones, but actually the councils don't change how they're zoning properties or how they're zoning land. So we'll see how it actually gets implemented. In terms of housing oversupply, I am always very skeptical about politicians saying this is going to be the thing that really changes everything. I think it probably will have an impact. When I look back at, I think it was episode 700 or something, a couple of years back, where we were talking about Labor's reforms. What we said back then is, yes, this could enable more housing. I hope it does enable more housing because that would be a really, really good thing if our housing market becomes more stable. But I don't think that it completely kills the housing market. And the reason is that developers still have to have an incentive to build properties. And over time, we know that building costs continue to go up. Over time, real land prices will continue to go up as incomes rise. And so the only way you'd get into a housing oversupply is in two real situations. Number one is kind of what we've seen, where you go through a property boom and you get to the height of the market and developers are building. The arse falls out of the market and then they're like, oh, we've built a few too many houses. Now, that is not a permanent oversupply because the population will continue to grow and those houses will get soaked up by natural market demand and developers will massively pull back while that housing supply gets cleared. That's kind of what's happening at the moment. That's why the number of dwelling consents has really fallen off a cliff. The second way is if the government decided to subsidise home building and say, we really want to push for housing supply, and so we're going to put our thumb on the scale in the market to make sure that more properties are built. But in a free market, over the longer term, you tend not to see massive permanent housing oversupplies, because there might be periods where people are building too much, but then developers pull back after that, and that excess stock starts to get absorbed.
So I don't think you're going to see any massive drops to house prices as a result of this, and particularly in its infancy in terms of actually becoming policy. And I think the thing to remember is, again, this is going to be a 2 to 5 year journey. If it gets in place and it doesn't get intervention from Labor government taking over and scrapping the whole thing again. And you've got to remember there are other factors that are going to happen at the same time, simultaneously. So as interest rates come down and population growth increases, you may see migration numbers increase again. Again, this kind of all offsets each other.
Well, I suppose you never want to be... I always think you never want to be too rose-tinted glasses, right? And be like, okay, this won't have any impact, because it certainly could have an impact. But at the same time, you don't want to be so scared or believe politicians' promises so much that you're like, this is going to change everything. I'll give you another example. So as part of the government's most recent changes, they're like, we want to introduce way more building products into New Zealand. And so we were talking about, well, how much of an impact has that had? Now, remember, we were talking about that probably a year and a half ago when the coalition agreements first came out, late 2023. I don't think anybody's seen any impact in terms of more building products being introduced. In fact, I think I was just reading in Business Desk, people saying, yeah, that's not going to have any impact. So you do want to kind of live in the real world and say, okay, there could be some changes. We don't want to underestimate them. We also don't want to overestimate them. But this is always why I say to people, don't bank on house prices going up by 7% a year like they have in some cases in the past. Use a more conservative rate when you're forecasting your property investment numbers, and use kind of 5% for all of New Zealand and maybe 6% for Auckland and Queenstown. So that's the government policy. That could be the housing crisis killer. Could it lead to a housing oversupply? And also, when will it all kick in? Right, let's wrap it up there. But please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. It really does help us get the message out to more people. Thanks for listening to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Steve McKnight.
I'm Andrew Nicol.
We're going to be back in tomorrow with even more daily strategies, tactics, and insights to help you get the most out of the New Zealand housing market. Until next time.